Welcome to another Inebriated Past. I'm your host, Matt Christman. It's been a minute, huh? We're back with a new rap. So, I've noticed that last year or so, certainly since the Bernie campaign ended, that there's been this renewed interest in John Brown as a historical figure. There was the Showtime miniseries with Ethan Hawke that happened last year, which I thought was pretty bad, frankly, but your mileage may vary on that one. But that's been part of a greater desire to talk about this guy, to frankly fetishize this guy, because in a time when it seems like there's no way for anybody to move forward, in a time when it seems like we're caught in a ringer of a ratchet of continuing downward political misery, that it's impossible to imagine regular people operating from regular motivations and regular constraints, acting against it effectively. We're just too conditioned, it seems like. We take too much wrong for granted. And there's this, I think, nascent idea, this inchoate yearning for a heroic model. And I think the John Brown fixation is part of that urge. We look to John Brown and we see somebody who is also alive at a time when we had a monstrous, inconceivably monstrous political economic system in the form of slavery that seemed like it was absolutely unchallengeable, and it was at the very heart of the American project. And in this stalemate, in this broken consensus, Brown acted with the purity of vision and will and virtue and clarity to cut through the Gordian knot by recognizing exactly what the moment needed to change the nature of the political contest and the stakes that both sides would be bringing to that contest. And he was able to do that because he had this positively anachronistic moral vision, where he saw, like many Northern abolitionists did, black people as fully human. But he didn't just see it the way somebody like maybe William Lloyd Garrison did. He felt it, and he felt it as a constant, ceaseless pain that could only be soothed by acting against the institution that created it. And for him to do that required him to be a being of almost perfect virtue. And I think we imagine that if we're going to get out of the moment we're in now, we're going to need a resurgence of virtue. And we're going to need models of virtuous action. And I think, frankly, a lot of people look to John Brown because they like to imagine that that's what they would have been like in that moment, and that they can apply that WWJBD rubric to their current moment to try to act more virtuously. And I think that is a totally understandable and commendable urge, and I think that everyone should look within to find where they can more readily access their empathic engine of action. But I think today it'd be more interesting to talk about another figure of the Civil War era, a figure who I think was a force for good in a way that very few people were during the time, as we would, examine it from the distance of centuries, or a century and a half, I guess. But emphatically not a paragon of virtue, emphatically not someone who was from a young age burning with a righteous fire the way that John Brown was, because the arc of this person, I think, is much more relatable to the average person, much more relatable to their lives and their imperfections and their weaknesses, and also speaks to another crucial ingredient that we're going to need to move forward politically. Not just virtue, but opportunity. Because what we have with the person I'm going to be talking about is someone who was refined towards grace, I guess you'd say, by experience, not by some internal moral honing beacon like John Brown had. We're talking about a person who is, by any objective measurement, a scoundrel, a person who did not obtain with bourgeois morality or, in fact, any other form of conventional ethics, but who also experienced things over the course of his life and had encounters that pushed him in a direction that, no matter what it said about his change of heart, made him a person who had a different effect on the world. This has been a hell of a build-up to say that today we're talking about General Congressman Governor Benjamin Franklin Butler, otherwise known as the Beast, sometimes known as Spoons, a Civil War general and politician who took an amazing career arc from being a pre-war pro-slavery Democrat, a doughface, as they were known in the North, because he's from Massachusetts, and became, by the end of his life, not only a radical Republican, but then beyond that, the figurehead of a proto-populist Greenback Party that endorsed things like women's suffrage and rights for laborers at a time when the bipartisan consensus was fully on the side of capital. So let's talk about how we get from a guy who voted for the South's preferred candidate for president in 1860, John Breckinridge, to someone who is sponsoring some of the most consequential Reconstruction legislation as a radical Republican after the war. So let's talk about the life and times of Benjamin F. Butler, who represents to me the possibility that are always inherent in any political moment, because what determines our political trajectory isn't always anything that we can predict. A lot of the times it's things, it's events, it's engagements that occur that shock us and take us by surprise, and that we have to re-reckon our understanding of the world around. So Benjamin Butler, born and raised in New Hampshire, the son of old school Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, a grandfather who had fought in the French and Indian War, a grandfather who had fought with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, and then became a privateer on the West Indian Sea, where he died. Later in life, Butler would actually sue a newspaper man for claiming in an article that his dad had been executed for piracy. He proved in court that his father had been a chartered privateer and had died of typhoid. And so it was, in fact, libel. So young Butler wanted to follow in his family's military tradition and go to West Point, but his strict Baptist mother wanted him to become a minister. So she sent him to college, where he annoyed everybody and switched over to a study in law. And he became a young lawyer and Democratic speechmaker in Lowell, Massachusetts, which was one of the very first industrial towns in America. Our first real experience in factory economics in America was in Lowell, Massachusetts, where the first domestic textile mills were being built and staffed by armies of young workers, many of them young women, actually. And this place was a hotbed of both dominant Whig politics among the local elites and manufacturers, the people who owned all those mills. They ran the town, and they were all Whigs, as most of the leadership of the state of Massachusetts was. Massachusetts being the merchant heart of the North, and therefore the heart of federalism. And then after the death of federalism, the heart of Whiggism, which was its descendant. But there's also a burgeoning working class politics. It's that by necessity and tradition found itself allied with the, at that point, emerging democracy, the Democratic Party, figureheaded by General Jackson, whose father Butler had served with at New Orleans, and created behind the scenes by the wily fox of Kinderhook, Martin Van Buren. And so Butler, young lawyer, young roustabout, begins making appeals on behalf of these disenfranchised laborers for a 10-hour day, which at the time would have been a reduction from the standard 14-hour day. And so this young, successful lawyer who's very effective in court, is well known as a jurist. He plays a double game where he is making a name for himself in Democratic politics while advocating for a 10-hour day, while also using his lucrative law practice to purchase shares in one of the mills and becoming a majority owner of a mill. And while the 10-hour day campaign failed in the face of the opposition of both the Whigs and the hunker right-wing Democrats of the area, Butler did institute the 10-hour day at his own factory. So there you go. Your classic case of ethical capitalism. So from this beginning, Butler makes his way in Massachusetts politics. He becomes a Democratic member of first the House and then the state Senate, of the state House and then the state Senate. And the whole time he is advocating the slavery issue is emerging as the key conflict point in politics. Now, Butler, in the weeds in local politics in Lowell, like most Northern Democrats, didn't really care about slavery. They thought it was an annoying distraction and something that undermined what should have otherwise been the iron political alliance between the rural South and the laboring North. And so Butler, like many Democrats, was vehemently opposed to abolitionism, abolition incitement of any kind. He wanted the issue mostly to go away. And so he was one of the faction of Northern Democrats fully committed to accommodating the Southern position on slavery, on all of the questions of expanding slavery into territories, Texas, the territory taken from Mexico after the Mexican-American War. At every point, there was a faction of Democrats whose entire instinct was to let the baby have its bottle. Who really cares about slavery? I care about my local political races, my local patriotic networks, my war with the bank or whatever the fuck. And they were known derisively by the more anti-slavery Democrats as dough faces, because their faces could be molded like dough because of their lack of principles. The dough faces controlled the Democratic Party all the way in the lead up to the Civil War. The presidents who precede Lincoln in the White House are a murderer's row of northern dough faces: Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire and James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. And Butler was a dough face's dough face. When the sectional crisis heats up, thanks to Kansas, thanks to the spark that John Brown helped light, erupting into a fucking inferno there in the prairies, by 1860, the Whig Party, the northern, the more northern concentrated party of manufacturers and merchants and urban townsfolk, basically, which was more opposed to slavery because it was more middle class and therefore more concerned about questions of morality, more able to allow their politics to revolve around a abstraction from their life like slavery. They had the time and energy to care about what was happening in the plantations of the South because their lives were secure in middle class comfort in the North. And as a result of that, and growing anti-slavery sentiment among yeoman Northerners and even working class Northerners, that they were going to have to compete with slavery as an economic model, and they would not be able to maintain their freedom in that situation. Between those two groups, the Whig Party had broken up over slavery. The small number of Southern Whigs who were concentrated in the towns, as you could imagine, and among large capital-intensive plantation industries like Louisiana sugar, were just not enough to overcome the sectional tilt of the party, and it broke up into essentially the Republican Party, organized around the principle of opposing slavery, and the Know Nothing Party, organized around the principle of avoiding sectional conflict by blaming Catholics. Now, the Democrats, because they had more sectional balance, there was the center of gravity of the party was in the South, but there still was a very significant Democratic constituency in the North. So they were able to hold it together a little longer, especially because those dough faces at the helm were just conceding everything to the Southerners. And Northern Democratic sentiment was happy to do it because guys like Butler really were the least concerned about slavery you could imagine in this country. But the South kept pushing the issue. The South kept raising the stakes and demanding a further and further codification of slavery as the sort of infinite. They were dead set on establishing slavery as the default political economy for the rest of the United States, which at a time when America's entire project was westward and for the South, southern facing. The South was demanding that all of this territory that was going to be incorporated into the country and determine its destiny would be slave territory. That for many of these Northerners, that possibility foreclosed the West to them because they didn't want to have to go compete with slavery or be around black people because they were all incredibly racist. So by 1860, the sectional crisis is so overheated, and the working class and small farmer opinion among Northerners was turning against slavery so hard that the party entered the convention with the Southern extremists concentrated in South Carolina, essentially determined to break open the party because they actually wanted a Republican to win so that they could have an excuse to secede, which they had all decided long ago was the only rational outcome and only inevitable outcome of the sectional conflict, which they were correct about. A house divided itself against itself cannot stand. They were going to have to secede at some point, and they wanted to pick a point that they thought was advantageous to them. And the Northern Democrats go in allied behind Stephen Douglas, and even though he had been an accommodationist, even he had to draw a line in the sand just because Northern public opinion had been pushed that much further into hostility to extension of slavery. And Butler goes there as a delegate, and he pledges himself for the first 5 ballots to vote for Douglas. But then after those ballots go by and a candidate has not been chosen and Douglas can't get a majority and Butler is no longer pledged to Douglas, he notices that the Douglas faction is drawing a line, is actually putting its foot down, is calling the bluff of the Southern faction and sort of daring them to leave. And Butler, who is fully committed to preserving the Union at all costs and doing whatever it took to placate the South to make that happen, decides that he's not going to vote for Douglas anymore. He's going to vote for somebody who wasn't even really in the running, but who he knew personally as a virtuous person who, yes, was a Southerner, yes, was a slave-owning planter, but was also a gentleman who had told Butler in confidence that he would not support secession. And so on the 6th ballot, Butler starts announcing when they come to him that he is voting for Senator Jefferson Davis. So Butler votes for Jefferson Davis on dozens of ballots as they try to get a majority. Eventually, the whole thing breaks down. The Northern Democrats nominate Douglas. Southerners nominate the vice president at the time, John C. Breckinridge, who ran on a maximal Southern demand for assurances of slavery's extension into the territories, but who also disavowed secession as a remedy. So after that happens, Butler endorses Breckinridge, runs for governor on the Breckinridge ticket, which of course got a handful of votes, because by this point, Northern opinion is fully set and the Republicans sweep the North, especially Massachusetts, which was the eastern headquarters of Republicanism. So the country is at war. Butler's dough-faced butt-kissery has failed in its goal. The South is taking their toys and leaving. What is he to do? Well, like many Northern Democrats who went down to the wire insisting that the South needed to be placated at any cost, once the secession happens, snap to and affirm their commitment to the Union. Because for a guy like Butler, unlike the Southerners, the point of their political collaboration, the reason that guys like Butler collaborated with the South, is because they wanted to succeed politically within the framework of the United States, which they thought was the proper expression of America's political will. They believed its ideology, and there was nothing in conflict between its power and their pursuit of power within its structures. For the Southerners, for the Southern Democrats, the Union was always a convenience. The Union was useful to the extent that it allowed slavery to persist, because slavery was the political economic foundation of a separate political entity. It was formally part of the United States, but it had never been assimilated. That assimilation had been resisted all through American history. The Constitution was created explicitly to prevent the assimilation of slave agriculture into the greater American political project. And so when the South decides that they're going to destroy the Union, guys like Butler, this is not a difficult question. The point of kissing you people's ass about slavery was to keep America going, to keep a political coalition together that could seize power. What the fuck are you doing? In fact, you're blowing it for us. Now every Democrat looks like a fucking traitor, you assholes. And so Butler snaps to, immediately goes to work getting himself a commission in the Army. And he had been a commander of a civil militia unit, sort of like a proto-National Guard thing, before the war, which is very common among prominent citizens in small towns. Being like the militia commander is sort of like being chief of the JCs or the Elks Club or something. And they'd get together and march around and stuff. But he had never gone to West Point, and he had no formal military training. And so he doesn't really have any claim to the office, but he does have connections to the Democratic Party, and some of those Democrats were being integrated into the Republican Party and into government. One of them was the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, and Cameron intercedes to get the governor of Massachusetts, who is a Republican who hated Butler, a commission as a brigadier general. So he's commissioned as a brigadier general, but he doesn't have any troops. So what Butler does is he uses his connections to a local bank, which he'd made in all of his wheelings and dealings as a mill owner and lawyer, to advance credit to the state to fund a militia company with the express proviso that Butler be the commander. And so the governor is basically stuck with him. So Butler is put in command of troops who are initially put in charge of occupying Baltimore, because Maryland at the point was a slave state, but the states that were close, the slave states that were closest to the Mason-Dixon line, did not secede generally because more than anything, they were too close to the military power of the United States to pull off the creation of a parallel governmental structure and military the way that states were able to in the deeper South. So even though there were tons of pro-slavery sentiment in Maryland, and especially in the city of Baltimore, Maryland never seceded, in part because U.S. troops occupied it from the second that the conflict began. And that meant that Butler was sent to Baltimore to assert U.S. authority over a very hostile region. So Butler occupies Baltimore, throws down a heavy hand on these motherfuckers, which is going to be his signature. If we're going to have a war, then God damn it, fine, we're going to have a war, and we're going to win. And so that gets him the enmity of the press for being overly harsh with his martial law. And he started already at that point getting a reputation in the South as a particularly savage Yankee. Butler lays the smackdown in Maryland and for a time in Delaware. And in Delaware, though, interestingly enough, you see how at this point Butler is really still willing to really meet the slave owners halfway when he gets to Delaware, and the terrified planter elite tell him that that there's a slave uprising that's in the works, and that they're all going to get massacred, and that they're all afraid that the Union Army is there to help the slaves. And Butler reassures them by sending out troops. There is no insurrection, nothing happens. But he does a little demonstration for their benefit, which got him criticized by Northern Republicans. So he's getting it from both ends here. But Butler goes to Virginia, where he shows that he is, in fact, yes, an amateur at war. He bungles a couple of battles. He starts getting criticized. He starts getting into arguments with other generals about who's responsible for what. And he's making enemies. While he's in Virginia, though, and occupying Fort Monroe, Butler first encounters runaway slaves in large numbers, because as soon as the local plantations hear that Union troops are in the area, enslaved people from the surrounding areas start making their way to the Union lines, seeking what they think will be freedom. Now, it had been the policy of the U.S. government at this point, wherever they encountered runaways like that, was to return them to their masters. Because at this point, it's not a war against slavery, it's a war against treason. It's a war against disunion. And they don't want to raise the social stakes. And Butler, though, faced with this military exigency, decides, using his legal mind, well, so these guys claim that that this is their property and that it's my responsibility to give it back to them. But they also claim that they seceded from the country that I represent, and that therefore I have no authority. I have no authority over them, and vice versa. So they have no right to ask for anything. And Butler determines these refugee slaves to be contraband of war, which means that they are on the same level as like bales of cotton or provisions that would be seized from an enemy. But this really solved a problem that the United States government really didn't have a solution for at that point, because the existing system really wasn't working, and it was getting more and more absurd. I mean, you're literally you are aiding the enemy if you have to return slaves who have run away from behind enemy lines. And so Butler, without having to worry about the political repercussions the way that Lincoln or someone would, just says unilaterally, all right, you guys, if you make it to the lines, you're free. And here's a paycheck. We need you to drive a wagon. We need you to dig ditches, but we will be paying you for it and providing you with housing and food instead of not doing that. And this ruffles feathers in Washington too, because it's not something that had been signed up for, nothing that had been decided in state, but it was a response to conditions, is what it was, and it gave Butler his first encounter with black people in any large numbers. So Butler, for a few months, goes back to Massachusetts to raise more troops, and he gets into a big fight with the state governor because he wants to recruit an all doughface regiment. He wants to get a regiment that is entirely made up of both Protestant and Catholic American Democrats who had opposed the Republicans to the end. Guys like him, because he wanted to prove their loyalty. And the governor, who is a absolutely hyper partisan Republican, the governor, John Andrew, doesn't want that. They have to have a big fight over who gets to appoint officers. And so after having this slap fight with the governor of Massachusetts over who is going to make up this military unit, he is assigned to command the troops who will be attacking New Orleans with Admiral Farragut. And so he steams down to New Orleans, where Farragut dams the torpedoes, goes full speed ahead, conquers the city, and Butler becomes the military governor of New Orleans. And he does that occupation duty. And this is in May of 1862. He takes command in New Orleans. And the people there are really fucking pissed. They hate this Yankee invasion. They are restive. The day that they took the city, a mob led by a local gambling impresario named William Mumford tore down the flag, the American flag that was hoisted above the customs house, and tore it up, dragged it in the streets, and handed it out pieces out to people. And according to Butler, he when he heard about it, he said, "I'll see the man who did that hanged." And he fucking did it. He actually did it. It took him a while, but he found and executed a guy for tearing down the American flag. The entire time they were running up to the moment of it occurring, everyone in town assumed he wouldn't do it. There were mobs in the streets demanding that he be released. Everyone assumed that it would just be too monstrous and too incendiary an act for him to carry out. And everyone asked for clemency. And then the day of the hanging, Mumford gave an impassioned speech about his patriotism and how he did he felt what he did was right. You know, some real Sidney Carton stuff. And everyone turned to Butler, assuming that he would give the glad hand and say, "All right, never mind. Don't do it again." But instead, he just does the fucking Commodus thumbs down, and they hang the motherfucker. And it causes outrage not only throughout the South, but in the North and in Europe. And in fact, the Confederate government of Jefferson Davis, who he voted for at the convention in 1860, put a $10,000 price on his head, that if he was to be captured, he'd be executed. And anyone who brought him in would get 10 grand. He also issued an order after a number of high society Dianes of New Orleans showed their ladylike nature by spitting on and attacking the occupation troops, who, by virtue of the social mores of the time, were restrained from responding. An incident that culminated with Admiral Farragut getting a chamber pot dumped on his head from a balcony led Butler to issue Special Order 28, which said that any woman in the city who did not show proper courtesy to an American soldier would be treated, quote, as a woman of the town plying her avocation, which is Victorian for walking the streets, meaning that they could be disrespectful in their treatment in return, and in fact, may even arrest them. And it instantly caused a huge furor and outrage all across the South and even across the Atlantic. Butler was denounced in Parliament by the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, for his crude and unchivalrous behavior. But Butler pointed out the rest of his life, there were no more spitting incidents. The ladies treated his troops with respect because they didn't want to see themselves brought low because they were fancy, rich ladies with parasols. So it wasn't just a heavy hand, though. Butler also did a heroic job with sanitation and introduced a strict quarantine and garbage disposal process that significantly reduced yellow fever in the city, which was largely a military exigency because Union troops are from New England and the Northwest. They don't really have exposure to those tropical diseases, and a lot of the Confederates were sort of just hoping that the entire garrison would just die off of yellow fever the way that the Leclerc expedition did in Haiti. So Butler, to avoid that, made sure that the rivers ran clear, and it saved a bunch of lives. But that did not make the local elites happy. They hated him. Not only did he, in addition to these outrages, he censored newspapers. He seized a tremendous amount of cotton from local producers that he claimed was going to be smuggled, often without evidence. He actually then would have this cotton auctioned off with the proceeds going to the military occupation. And he had his brother, Andrew Jackson Butler, who was also an officer in New Orleans, bid secretly for them and get them at super low prices and then sell them on the open market. So he's hustling. He is a hustler. He's confiscating personal property that he claims is en route to being smuggled. That's how he gets the nickname Spoons, because he was accused to have stolen a set of fine china or a set of fine silverware from a aristocratic New Orleans lady. They hated him so much that they put his picture on the bottom of chamber pots so that they could literally shit in his face. The other nickname they gave him was Beast, because he was a perfect example of the brutal ungentlemanliness of Yankee culture. Like, he was the avatar of everything that Southern gentility was supposed to defend against. They really did feel in the South that they were protecting a way of life around a manner that involved personal honor and personal propriety as presiding ethics. Of course, they could do that because it was all built on top of literal human misery. And what else are you going to do but sit in your fucking veranda and figure out ways to feel vaguely uncomfortable? It's your only fucking option. And so a guy like Butler coming down and just laying the smack down without sentimentality, without any respect for chivalric codes, he was a one-man representation of what commerce did to you, what being a merchant, what working, what dealing with capital will do to you. But thanks to all these conflicts, he's getting a lot of making enemies in Washington, partially with the Secretary of State, William Seward, because one of the things he does to cause problems is that he seizes money from consuls, from foreign consuls in New Orleans, claiming that it was money that was going to be smuggled across enemy lines. And this causes diplomatic incidents. And also, he has now become very unpopular with the Democratic press, his own party. They now have decided that he is, in fact, as much of a demon as the traitorous slaveocracy calls him. The only people who were applauding his behavior and his occupation of New Orleans were radical Republicans. These people who, they fucking loved him. They thought he was a hero. And after Butler's enemies get him recalled from command of New Orleans in December of 1862, when Butler gets back to the North, he finds huge crowds of Republicans thronging him. He finds his name scandalized and slandered in the Copperhead Democratic press, his erstwhile comrades. So Butler decides, you know what? Fuck those guys. I'm a Republican because these guys get me. So Butler, after coming back north, he gets back in command. He goes back to Virginia, where he recruits units made of Confederate prisoners of war. There were a lot of them during the Civil War. Guys who were taken prisoner and then joined Union military units. A lot of them were the upcountry hill people who generally were hostile to the entire Confederacy and were just kind of waiting for an opportunity to switch sides. And so these guys were called galvanized Yankees, like they had been electrocuted into conversion, or they had been converted by electricity. And Butler raises a unit of these guys. And during the Petersburg campaign, Butler is put in command of a number of black military units. He had actually organized a integrated black militia into the Union Army when he was in command of New Orleans. He had raised units of black troops in Louisiana when he'd been in command there. And then in Virginia, he was put in command of more black troops. And during the Petersburg campaign, he commanded black troops in the Battle of Chaffin's Farm, which is also known as New Market Heights. And there's a speech that Butler gave when he was shepherding the Civil Rights Act of 1875 through Congress, which was the last gasp effort to codify civic equality in terms of access to public accommodations for black people in the waning days of Reconstruction. And Butler was the House manager of that bill. And he described the Battle of New Market Heights in his speech and then later in his autobiography. Then I said, "Your cry when you charge will be, 'Remember Fort Pillow.' And as the sun rose up in the heavens, the order was given forward, and they marched forward, steadily as if on a parade, went down the hill across the marsh, and as they got into the brook, they came into range of the enemy's fire, which vigorously opened upon them. They broke a little as they forded the brooks, and the column wavered. It was at a moment of intensest anxiety, but they formed again as they reached the firm ground, marching steadily on with closed ranks under the enemy's fire, until the head of the column reached the first line of abatis, some 150 yards from the enemy's works. Then the axemen ran to the front to outweigh the heavy obstructions of defense, while 1,000 men of the enemy, with their artillery concentrated, poured from the redoubt a heavy fire upon the head of the column, hardly wider than the clerk's desk. The axemen went down under that murderous fire. Other strong hands grasped the axe in their stead, and the abatis is cut away. Again, at double quick, the column goes forward to within 50 yards of the fort, to meet there another line of abatis. The column halts, and there a very fire of hell is pouring upon them. The abatis resists and holds. The head of the column seems literally to melt away under the rain of shot and shell. The flags of the leading regiments go down, but a brave black hand seizes the colors. They are up again and wave their starry light over the storm of battle. Again the axemen fall, but strong hands and willing hearts seize the heavy, sharpened tree and drag them away. And the column rushes forward, and with a shout which now rings in my ear, go over that redoubt like a flash, and the enemy never stopped running for 4 miles. It became my painful duty, sir, to follow in the track of that charging column, and there, in a space not wider than the clerk's desk and 300 yards long, lay the dead bodies of 543 of my colored comrades, fallen in defense of their country, who had offered up their lives to uphold its flag and its honor as a willing sacrifice. And as I rode along among them, guiding my horse this way and that, lest he should profane with his hooves what seemed to me the sacred dead, and as I looked on their bronzed faces upturned in the shining sun to heaven, as if in mute appeal against the wrongs of the country for which they had given their lives, and whose flag had only been to them a flag of stripes on which no star of glory had ever shone for them, feeling I had wronged them in the past, and believing what was the future of my country to them, among my dead comrades, there I swore to myself a solemn oath. May my right hand forget its cunning and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I ever fail to defend the rights of these men who have given their blood for me and my country this day and for their race forever. And God helping me, I will keep that oath." Now, did he mean that? He was a politician after all. He was given a speech in the well of Congress. He was trying to rile up the hoopleheads. demagoguery about Reconstruction and about the honored dead of the war was a time-honored, cynical practice of post-war Republican politicians. They called it waving the bloody shirt. Benjamin Butler was a master of waving the bloody shirt. In fact, he literally invented waving the bloody shirt. So maybe he was just demagoguing and using emotive language to make a point. Sure. But when you look at what happened after that, Butler runs for Congress as a Republican in 1866 in opposition to presidential Reconstruction, which was a attempt to basically try to reestablish the pre-war economic order in the South with slavery, formal slavery replaced by de jure slavery. And Butler ran for Congress as a Republican, opposed to that. And he spent the next decade in Congress fighting to make Reconstruction as punitive to the South and its political leadership as possible, while also pushing as far as possible for the extension of the protection of rights to former slaves in the South. After Thaddeus Stevens died, which he unfortunately did early in Reconstruction, Butler became the single most prominent advocate for black civil rights in Congress. He managed the failed impeachment of Andrew Johnson in the Senate. He shepherded through legislation like the Ku Klux Klan Act, which authorized the federal government to detain night riders and to protect the lives and liberties of former slaves. He was absolutely willing to bring down the hammer of authority on the planter rulers in defense of black rights, even if it was simply due to personal vindictiveness, because these were the motherfuckers who tried to shoot at him and called him the beast and put a contract out on his head. Even if it was just because of spite, the outcome was that he was one of the most prominent champions of a meaningful Reconstruction that emerged during that period. And what I mean by that is not just that he was the foremost man in defense of black civil rights and black equality. One of the bills that he pushed through was an attempt to create desegregated public institutions in the 1870s. And it was passed in a watered down and unenforceable form, but then ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883. But in addition to that, Butler also pushed for creating an economic model that could have allowed that to happen. Because this fundamental conflict at the heart of Reconstruction is that the Republican Party that had ended slavery also was organized around free trade liberal principles that demanded tight money and powerful financial institutions. There was a hard money, a gold standard orthodoxy among Republicans who had authorized fiat currency greenbacks during the war as a war measure to get back onto the gold standard as quickly as possible, because that's what business wanted. That's what the banks in London wanted. That's what Northern capital, which had accumulated significant power and influence and coordination over the course of the war, wanted. They wanted tight money. They wanted U.S. debt paid back in gold and not in fiat currency. They wanted the monetary supply to be shrunk. Well, that's a recipe for deflation. That's a recipe for misery at the base of society. And what the Republican policy on money did was doom all the efforts in Reconstruction that could have made it economically viable, because the South the entire United States economy went into deep depression in the 1870s that it didn't leave for a generation. And it was even worse in the South. And a large reason for that was because of tight credit. And Northern Republican orthodoxy was for tight credit. Even guys like Charles Sumner, who were maximalists on the moral question of equality. In his case, he didn't really know or care anything about economics, and so all his friends in Boston tell him that hard money is good, and so he was for it. Butler was a greenbacker. Butler said, as soon as he got to Congress, "What are you people talking about? Print the money. We print the money. That's What do we just watch? We just won a war by printing money. We have a war to fight now against the remnant of slavery. Let's fight it with the same money we've been printing. And this put him at war with the Republican Party. And so his term in office is this quixotic attempt, on the one hand, to create a fiscal stimulus that could have allowed for a flowering of economic activity in the South, perhaps organized around redistributing planter land to smallholders, both black and white. And maybe that makes acceptance of the socially destabilizing equality enactments more palatable to people. We'll never know, because the Southern economy was strangled basically in its crib after the war by hard money. And among Republicans, Butler was one of the very few to have that vision, because what you have after the Civil War is with the organizing principle of slavery, which had defined political boundaries in the generation leading up to the war, gone. The parties had to find a new basis for existence. And the Republican Party, being as it was, based primarily among that urban middle class who opposed slavery on moral grounds, but who were direct and indirect beneficiaries of the capitalist mode of production that was emerging. And it had no interest in seeing economic power, as in control of capital, closer to the hands of regular people. Because while greenbackism isn't, of course, socialism, in this context, when the American labor movement is inchoate, unorganized, and the political system doesn't really have a vocabulary for socialism within it, greenbackism becomes the stand-in for that impulse towards common ownership of capital, just in the American vocabulary. And it is a tragedy of American history that America's class politics does not gain coherence in time to be wedded to that, to be wedded to the Reconstruction Project, for example. And Butler ends up becoming a greenbacker. He runs for governor a number of times in Massachusetts on a fusion Democrat greenback ticket, and eventually wins. He gets one term as governor of Massachusetts, one 2-year term, before the Republicans gather steam, get their shit back together, and beat him out of office after obstructing the hell out of him. And then he ran as a greenback candidate for president in 1884. While he's losing the governorship, he runs for president on the tickets of the Greenback Party and the Anti-Monopoly Party, after challenging Grover Cleveland for the Democratic nomination and failing to secure it. He doesn't get a lot of votes. He only gets 175,000 votes of the 10 million cast in 1884. But he articulates within his political person the third way, the way not taken out of the conflagration of the Civil War. Because you see, after the Civil War, the Democratic Party cohere into a party of urban machine politics and Southern white reaction, accommodating capitalism from like the precarious position. And the Republicans become the party of finance capital. And the death of slavery becomes, in retrospect, just part of the project of capital rationalizing human interactions, getting rid of these inefficient quasi-feudal structures and replacing them with liberal contract relationships. And that was what a lot of the people who made up the Republican Party had always sought. But Butler, who didn't start the war as a Republican, who actually fought the war and had experiences during that war and encountered things, the experience of the war that Butler had fused the populist politics he'd had as a member of the democracy before the war to a greater understanding that the natural extension of his politics back then, the thing he really cared about, was embodied in a full civically equal society where there is no caste or class, and that facilitation of that comes from the liberation of the people from actual bondage, be it slavery or wage slavery. And that is a thread. It's a golden thread ideologically that runs through the Civil War, and very few people of power organized around it because there was no real percentage in it. All of the power and influence went in the other directions, and it was the lonely few who stood out there. And Butler was one of them. Now, part of it might have been because he had a real change of heart over the course of his life, and it made him into a more, empathic person. But the thing we have to remember is that while he's doing all of this, he's also being cartoonishly fucking crooked. He is as I said, an absolute spoilsman and corruption machine. Oh, he's a one-man machine. The guy, like I said, he auctioned off seized cotton to his own brother to sell on the fucking black market. He was a war profiteer. He made sure that the military uniforms that of his units were manufactured were spun at his mill. He manipulated government policy to aid his business interests. One of the things that he defended in the Republican Party to his death was the corrupt system of spoils and political patronage that replaced ideology as the motive force of the party. So he was the tool. He was the Janus face of corruption and virtue. But of course, in this period, corruption is just part of politics. Corruption is what the machine is made to do. The hard money orthodoxy of the post-war years was a product of corruption. Capital bought the government, and they dictated their own terms. That was corruption. The stuff that Butler did, while it is grubbier and more and it offends one's bourgeois sensibilities, is not anyway less moral than what is carried out above board. And it is a person like Butler, who has seen the whole range of experiences, to see the essential hypocrisy here, to see the hypocrisy of people who cried about him executing one guy in New Orleans, who turn up their nose at the massacre of hundreds of former slaves who are now American citizens, and who will allow the U.S. government to massacre every striker in town, but would refuse to allow black rights to be protected at bayonet point in the South. It is a crook. It's someone from the ground up. It's someone disabused of bourgeois sensitivities who sees through that. But who knows what was in his heart? What we know is that the experience of the war created a place for him to be, through incentives, internal and external, a place for him to be. And hey, he was the damn governor of Massachusetts. He ran for president. He authored vital civil rights legislation. That's a real person. That's a real possibility that existed with all the other possibilities during that period. And the real thing that kills me personally is that he had a possibility to have way more impact than he did, because in 1864, Butler was offered the vice presidency on the ticket with Abraham Lincoln. Hannibal Hamlin was not going to be the VP again, and they wanted a war Democrat. They wanted someone someone to represent the Democratic part of the coalition that made up the Republicans, because the Republican campaign in 64 was fixated on the idea of making the war effort nonpartisan. So they even dissolved as a party and ran as the National Union ticket. They didn't even use the word Republican on the tickets. And part of that was extending an olive branch to the Democrats. And their first call was to Butler. And Butler said, fuck you, I don't want to sit on my ass in Washington for 4 years. That's not going to make me any money. I'm out here ripping and running and fucking bawling. Why would I want to do that? And then they go to another war Democrat, and a Southerner in this case, Andrew Johnson, one of the worst political decisions ever made. And after Lincoln's assassination, Johnson personally steers Reconstruction in the most reactionary way possible. And most damagingly, he not only fails to enact land redistribution to former enslaved people, he has his fucking army break up concentrations of black land ownership where it had occurred, where military rule, like or Sherman's ceding of the Sea Islands to former slaves as a way, slave refugees as a way to reduce his overhead on his march to the sea. They were breaking up and confiscated. That land was confiscated because Johnson wanted to reinstitute white supremacy. I gotta believe that Butler in the seat in 1865, after Lincoln's assassination, with the blood of Lincoln still wet on his top hat, would not only have protected and sanctified land redistribution where it had occurred, he would have extended it, and he would have absolutely brought the fucking hammer of Thor down on the fucking Confederate leadership. Nobody's getting their fucking voting rights back after asking nicely, after writing a letter to the president, which is what Andrew Johnson had them do. He had the big men of Southern planter society who'd rebelled against the federal government write him letters asking to be pardoned, and he would. None of that for Butler, I can assure you. And for me, the value of thinking about a guy like Butler and thinking about the context and about the possibilities that are always there in any moment, no matter how retrospectively doomed all goodness seems, is to remember that that's always true, which means it's true now, which means that all possibilities are live in the moment. Because look at this guy. Look at how does this happen? When you consider what most Northern Democrats did after the war, during and after the war, become copperhead reactionaries who by the end of the war were actually rooting against the fucking United States. And then after the war became just absolutely vile racial demagogues. The Northern Democratic Party put out hair-raisingly racist shit during Reconstruction. And Butler was part of that machine before the war. And many people went out and fought and came back and did the same thing. And he didn't, which means it can be done. And means that our destinies are always live. All right, folks, I hope that made sense. If it didn't, I hope that Chris chopped out the parts that didn't, and you got something that is somehow audibly legible. Bye-bye. Among the settlers who emigrated from Great Britain to North America in the early colonial period, there were three dominant motivations. All of the colonists had them all to some degree or another, but in almost all of them, one predominated in their minds, and that was desperation, greed, and fanaticism. And the fanatics were concentrated on the stony, rocky lands of New England, not in the lush, agriculturally rich region of Jamestown, which was far too valuable to be left to a bunch of religious fanatics and had to be operated as a going, profit-seeking concern very early. The New England settlements were peopled by real believers, people who were adjusting to the rapid change of life that the early modern era had imposed on European subjects by enlivening their religion with a deep fire of personal revelation. This is the Puritan strain of Calvinism that explodes in Northern Europe as capitalism emerges. As capitalism destroys the old feudal religious bonds that kept people together and that also forestalled a full domination of capital, were being destroyed by the competition of the European states. And capitalism was wrenching people from their landed understanding of religious experience and personalizing it. And this personalization of religious experience became known as Protestantism, and it became the social logic of capitalism, because it had an explanation. It had a praxis that takes as its basis the notion that human interaction will no longer be dominated by the will of God. That is to say, our felt natural relationships with other people and other things, because the market in its intrusion has now turned us all into strangers in a way that we hadn't ever been before. And that means that the social reinforcement of religious belief are minimized. They are dissolved, and we are left more and more alone in more isolated social circumstances, in a competitive relationship with our neighbor, our Christian neighbor. And the neurotic Calvinism that erupts in England in the early 17th century is a response to this condition from people who have forfeited the social tie but still need some way to reinscribe their belief, some way to live their feeling of communion, of godly connection, of connection to a transcendent notion that is defined by the world and the people around us. And that world required a God that resided not at the hearth and not in public, a public that was now increasingly a market. It resided in the heart. It resided in the self, inscribed as defined against the whole, against the social. And a God, therefore, who becomes unknowable and inscrutable and terrifying. And that is what Calvinism imposes, this notion of God as someone who cannot be something that cannot be anticipated, and therefore something that must be feared. Because Calvin took his rationalist mind to the question of religion in a asocial context and realized that there could be no confirmation of who's going to heaven or who's going to hell by the world that they live in, because that is a world of chance and misery. And the experience of life on earth is determined by these naturalized market forces that have intruded and replaced the social bonds of feudalism. If you failed in the market, you were on your own for the first time in a real sense. You were there was no social expectation of cooperation with the struggling. There becomes a struggle of all against all. Hobbes is born really in the market, not in history and reality. It's born at this moment, this understanding of what it is to be a human in this desperate struggle for resources in an increasingly technological world. So in this world, God is no longer something that whose will can be divined by the world. The world is now tainted, fallen in a real sense. We have only to fear and tremble before God and essentially act as though we feel a connection to him, as though he were in our lives, because it is finally and totally out of our abilities to move towards God. It is up to God. And that means that there is predestination of souls, and there is no way of knowing if you're saved or not, except by spending your life acting like you are, which creates this terrifying internal panopticon that drives eventually this class of people as they come to the United States and form their social order and become the most adept merchants in the new capitalism of the new world and become more and more neurotic. But in the initial wave of immigration, those early Puritans were escaping a new order in England that they could not withstand morally, in that they could not stand to feel their connection to the world, to each other, to be severed so easily, because it was too much to ask for such people to feel separate from God for so long. And so they did the one thing that they could do. They tried to seek on what they thought of as a virgin and unspoiled territory where pre-existing social relationships didn't exist, that people of good faith, real belief, could come together and live together, cooperated, created a community of believers who could make a world where God's will could be known, where we could see God in the world because we are making it. Yes, we're using the market. Yes, we're using this new asocial religious conception, but we are using it together to remake a religion that is rooted and grounded in the land as well, and in our social relationships, as well as in our hearts. This is an attempt to wrest Protestantism basically away from the imperatives of the market, to re-socialize Protestantism. It can only do that absent the existing, dominating, totally socially oppressive matrix of late feudal European aristocracy. At this point, the crowned heads of Europe are a debauched, licentious bunch. They have not a spark of godliness among any of them. They've lived too comfortably too long. They have made heaven on earth in the castles and in the courts, and as such, don't really have to think too much about what happens after or what they're giving up by hoarding all of that pleasure, because it's not precarious as it is for a downwardly mobile merchant in early modern England, or a frantic amateur farmer trying to stay alive in Massachusetts by digging some goddamn green out of the rocky soil of New England. And of course, they were also desperate because many of them were downwardly mobile, and they were, of course, greedy because they imagined that God's will in the world would be their pleasure, their enjoyment of the world with each other. So, of course, they would be able to make a comfortable life for themselves here by expropriating from people who did not count in their moral calculus, who were too abstracted from their social experience to resonate as a full human. And they tried to make it work. The early New England colonies are essentially religious communes. I mean, they're sort of Jonestowns, but because of the fortuitous mass death of Native Americans in this region, who had been absolutely cut down by smallpox infection, courtesy of early American, like pre-English contact between Native peoples and European fishermen, meant that there was a lot of land that was just not could not even be contested by the local Native populations. And then those who did survive kind of needed after a while, needed the settlers as much as the settlers needed them. Or at least they felt that to be the case, or else they obviously could have killed them all. But they build these little theocratic statelets. And of course, they split over doctrine, and Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson have to go to Rhode Island because, what is this? Oh, no. If we leave it up to ourselves and we're in the market, over time, we are going to end up creating a very idiosyncratic religious convictions because they are not being reaffirmed socially, because I am not spending my time immersed in a religious sociality. I am spending it working. I am spending it trading, and I am spending it thinking about my soul as an isolated monad, not as a part of a greater spiritual tapestry, that is the consolation of religion. That's the actual thing that makes religious belief spiritually soothing. It's the itch that everything's trying to scratch in modernity and can't quite make it. And that is that we give it the name of God, but God is just the accumulation of our positive relationship, a positive emotional connection to the experience of life, to the sensual engagement of our bodies with other people in the world. So they start splitting up, start burning witches, of course, because it's not a stable conviction, because it is not socially reaffirmed. In fact, there is a social competition. The more godly appearing are going to more likely be the saved, right? The more successful materially and the more publicly pious will likely be the saved, right? If we think about it logically as God making a decision to save people, well, who's he going to save? It's getting ahead of God's thought process, basically. And that's a drive towards success, and that is a competitive drive away from each other. As they're trying to pull together, they're also being pushed apart by the competitive nature here, the competitive framework of being the most successful farmer, the one with the most land, the one with the most ease and comfort, the one who is able to devote the most of his life to the rituals and trappings of religious conviction are going to be the saved. And so the hearts of these religious communities are eventually just destroyed, and capital eventually comes for and consumes and overcomes all these social forms, swallows them and digests them, and creates the engine of North American capitalism, which is in the merchant trading communities and then later industrial hubs of New England. It is Boston as a trading capital before and during the American Revolution, and then the areas around Boston as the first industrial factory infrastructure in the United States. The mills, staffed mostly by young girls, something that you wouldn't think that Puritans fixated on building God City in the wilderness would really accept, would think that was part of a fucking godly world where young girls are forced to go into a room together and risk getting their arms ripped off by fucking machines. But it is necessary. The competitive framework is now lost its religious patina. Now by even the early republic, the descendants of the Puritans now barely believe in God at all as a real thing, have almost totally materialized their religious beliefs. John Adams isn't a Calvinist. He is a Unitarian. His son is basically a agnostic, and their descendants now are all of some or another strict secular humanist creed derived from the echoes of the social gospel of the original project of the city on the hill, like the social infrastructure necessary to have a godly social order. Now we have that at the end of history in the form of the secular creed of social liberalism. But that's all that's left because capitalism has hollowed out the rest. And while in the counting houses of Boston, people are just quietly and contentedly turning into secular humanists, out in the fields, the people struggling to rend a living out of the rocky earth of New England, those who are having to sell their labor for wages in the cities and be away from their families in order to stay alive, those who are doing the monstrous work of extracting surplus value from slave labor, or someone living in a pioneer cabin and in a life or death mortal battle with local native tribes whose land they're stealing. In those environs, the pull away from a grounded religious tradition is much more traumatic because it's not accompanied by total physical comfort and ease, which it is at the heart of capitalism. Around the edges, there's an accumulated misery that is piling up, that is increasingly being ascribed to the social order around people. People begin to feel that they are not living a life that can be conceived of as Christian, because they have been pulled by the compulsions of the market out of harmony, really, with the world around them, and they feel that, and they want to resist it. And so you see throughout early American colonial and then early American Republican history a cycle of explosions of religious fervor that accompany certain new stages of American colonial development and settlement development, and in capital intensification. And so one of the biggest bursts of these occurs in upstate New York. So upstate New York had been land that had been relatively recently settled by mostly settlers from New England who had essentially crapped out of social life, either from some combination of, and because of some combination of, as we said, greed, fanaticism, and desperation, moved around. And a lot of them ended up in northern and western New York because that land had been granted after the Revolutionary War. That land had been deeded to Revolutionary War veterans as payment for their service during the war, and a lot of it had been sold by those very veterans for cash in the economic crunch that happened after the Revolution during the Articles of Confederation years. So a lot of that land was being sold on the open market and was being bought by people looking to find some stability, some social stability. And the other thing drawing them there was the first and biggest public infrastructure project of the young America, the Erie Canal. I had a mule. His name was Sal. Went 15 miles on the Erie Canal. It was originally funded by. It was the brainchild of New York political dynast, Governor DeWitt Clinton, who, in the face of the Jeffersonian hostility to publicly funded works, which was epidemic at the time, Clinton pushed, as governor of New York, heavily for a public-funded canal connecting Lake Erie to New York City, and with the idea that it would stimulate economic growth. Now, this threw in the fleet. This is something that a lot of people in America thought was unconstitutional, but was also necessary for the American economy to grow. And so, even though a lot of the public sentiment was against it, the local demand for something there, and also the power of the economy of New York Harbor at that point, of the New York merchant class at that point, who desired to see this for their own benefit, like they would be able to do more. They would be able to do more trading. They would be able to make more money, and so they formed a powerful interest group pushing for the Erie Canal. And it was begun in 1917, and it took until 1821 to finish. So from 1817, you see this huge burst of economic activity as the Erie Canal is being built, as laborers swarm from across the country and from Europe to work building this canal. And then after the canal is done, this new efflorescence of urban culture in these ports along the canal within New York itself, sort of going down through New York. And it's this canal that brings capitalism in its advanced industrial form to the people who had fled the farthest from making an accommodation with capitalism spiritually, the people who were demanding something more out of life than submitting to this inhuman regime, who wanted to still feel God in their lives. And into their midst came this massive explosion of capitalist trade and infrastructure development. And it creates the Whig Party, in part from the political machine that comes up around Millard Fillmore in Buffalo, and the weed machine around William Seward. All that energy is unleashed by the Erie Canal, but so is a powerful amount of psychic discomfort and fear. There's the hoofbeats are coming to people who have been spending their entire lives trying to stay in some sort of harmony with a God that they could hear in their minds, and we're now having their ability to do so torn away from them. And there's a bit from Moby Dick in the chapter The Hoetown Story, describing a guy from the Erie Canal region that I think best exemplifies exactly what the social implications of the Erie Canal's construction through upstate New York were. So this is a guy describing the canal area. For 360 miles, gentlemen, through the entire breadth of the state of New York, through numerous populous cities and most thriving villages, through long, dismal, uninhabited swamps and affluent, cultivated fields, unrivaled for fertility, by billiard room and bar room, through the holy of holies of great forests, on Roman arches over Indian rivers, through sun and shade, by happy hearts or broken, through all the wide contrasting scenes of those noble Mohawk counties, and especially by rows of snow-white chapels, whose spires stand almost like milestones, flows one continual stream of Venetianly corrupt and often lawless life. There's your true Ashanti, gentlemen. There howl your pagans, where you ever find them, next door to you, under the long-flung shadow and the snug patronizing lee of churches. For by some curious fatality, as it is often noted of your metropolitan freebooters that they ever encamp around the halls of justice, so sinners, gentlemen, most abound in holiest vicinities. And then a little later, in sum, gentlemen, what the wildness of this canal life is emphatically evinced by this, that our wild whale fishery contains so many of its most finished graduates, and that scarce of any race of mankind, except Sydney men, are so much distrusted by our whaling captains. Nor does it at all diminish the curiousness of this matter that to many thousands of our rural boys and young men born along its line, the probationary life of the Grand Canal furnishes the sole transition between quietly reaping in a Christian cornfield and recklessly plowing the waters of the most barbaric seas. I think it gives you kind of a sense of the combustible social situation that existed here in this area. And so over the next 20 years or so, from the creation of the Erie Canal into the 1830s, you see this huge explosion of religious fervor in the counties of northern New York. It becomes known as the burned over district, as in every part of it has already had a massive wave of evangelical passion seize the local population and burn through, so that at a certain point, all of the energy had become extinguished. And what extinguished it was participation by many of the people of this region in a new explosion of millenary prophetic religious movements that emerge around charismatic figures who claim a personal prophetic relationship to their Christian souls, and that gathered people around them in new understandings of religious life. And the thing they all had in common is that they attempted to break people away from the relative isolation of rural life and the alienation of urban life that saw people spend very little time in churches. Many of these people were devoutly religious, read their Bibles fanatically, but had little to no interaction with formal church worship. And after a while, this, in a situation of constant precarity and marketization of life, leads to a explosive demand, a spiritual cry for some sort of new understanding of religious life. And that meant coming together into a community of faith that meets together more regularly, whose religious worship is more passionate, is more emotionally invested, provides more of a cathartic relationship to the alienations of life than was allowed for in the more sterile environs of conventional Protestantism. And so during this period, you see the explosion of the Millerites, a sect around a farmer named William Miller, who got his notebook out, went to his Bible, and figured out mathematically that the world was going to end in 4 years. I believe it was 4. It might have been less. And gathered around him a huge community of believers who went to the top of a hill on the appointed day and waited for the world to end, and when it didn't, had to walk back down, many of them having sold all of their possessions. And and amazingly, though, that was not the end of the movement. It eventually morphed into the Seventh-day Adventists. And to this day, they refer to this moment as the Great Disappointment. And the Branch Davidians, by the way, of Waco, were a offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists. So you see how this prophetic tradition explodes through America as people try to stabilize their relationship with religion in an increasingly godless world, an increasingly marketized world. But at the same time, the Jehovah's Witnesses are emerging, which is a very scholastic approach to biblical literalism, and that comes up with essentially a new textual read on the Bible. It's essentially literary criticism. Jehovah's Witnesses is literary criticism of the Bible. It says, you guys have been interpreting this wrong the whole time. This is what it actually means. And they get a lot of people in this increasingly intellectualized age, this increasingly empirically minded age, that gets a lot of supporters too. This is also the beginning of a lot of the spiritualism that will emerge more in the late 1900s among the anxious middle class, when you have rapping seances from the Fox sisters in Hydesville, New York. And you've got the Shakers coming together into religious communities of purity, which die out because they don't have sex with each other. But then you have more secular utopian movements like the Oneida Society, who are inspired by the utopian socialist Robert Owen and the French utopian socialist Charles Fourier into building a equitable, free social order that is not captured by the market. And there's more than this, even than Jemima Wilkinson and Ann Lee, John Humphrey Noyes. And they all get their supporters. They all gain their adherents of people who are looking for some new way to feel God in their life every day in America. And a lot of them are being pulled, as you're seeing, towards community, towards trying to pool resources, which is possible in this frontier land where the assumption will always be that the native population will be dispossessed and their land will be taken. And in that context, many people come together with a new take, basically, on Christianity that facilitates the perpetuation of religious community. And the most successful of these movements, in the sense that it did the most to shield those who participated in it from having to be stripped of their religious belief, be stripped of their understanding and sense of God in the world, are the Mormons. One of the families that moves to upstate New York in this time, pursuing elusive security, is the Smith family of Vermont. Joseph Smith Sr. and Lily Smith are the descendants of those Puritans, and they find themselves making a precarious living in that notoriously fickle New England topsoil. And eventually, after being defrauded by a business partner and forced to sell a farm in Vermont, Joseph Smith leads his family on a journey across New England. He ping-pongs from New Hampshire to Massachusetts to Connecticut, eventually comes back to Vermont. And it's in Vermont in 1805 when they give birth, where Lily gives birth to Joseph Smith Jr., one of their 11 children. But eventually, the entire Smith family moves to Palmyra, New York, in this region. And this whole time, both of the Smith parents are having deep religious journeys. Lily is for her whole life, is a devout Congregationalist, which is the evolved form of the early Puritan church in New England. But his father was never able to find any real comfort in any of the formal denominations. He bounced around from churches, and he mostly prayed privately. And he would claim that he had religious visions. And so in Palmyra, young Joseph Smith, who in his teen years, or as a young man, was stricken down by a bone infection, which caused him to have to spend 3 years on crutches. So young Joseph, this kid who had to sort of nurse himself back to health, by his early teens, is already evincing certain sensitivities to the world around him. He is a scryer in that he claims that he can look through glass to find buried treasure in the woods, which is part of a tradition of American, European settler folk magic, which until you have totally ripped people away from the land, is going to exist within any religious tradition, and that definitely survived into this point anyway within Christianity, although its days are numbered. He also was a water dowser who claimed that he could find water by using a stick to draw him to it. And by the time he was 15, he was having ecstatic religious visions that he described in detail to his parents and to family friends and to relations. And these visions were so powerful, and the way that he described them was so evocative, and the language he used felt so sort of ethereal and godly that people were very, very credulous. In 1832, he would describe his first youthful vision as a pillar of light above the brightness of the moon at noonday came down from above and rested upon me, and I was filled with the Spirit of God, and the Lord spake to me, saying, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee, so thy may walk in my statutes and keep my commandments. And one of the visions he got from this voice that he later identified with the angel Moroni were directions to hidden golden plates that were buried in the woods. And eventually Smith produced to people around him these golden plates with writing on them that appeared to be hieroglyphics and that Smith called New Egyptian. Now, while eventually Smith gains a small following of devoted early believers, including a man named Sidney Rigdon, who shares some visions with Smith, and who with Smith helps translate these plates using first a number of stones placed in a hat that he looked into, and also a pair of sort of spectacle things that he claimed came with the plates. And there's a number of attempts over the months to translate these plates, and there's some parts of it are written, they're destroyed, they have to start over again. What ends up coming out of this process is this thing that becomes known as the Book of Mormon, which is a description of, they later call it another testament of Jesus Christ. And this is, it is essentially a pseudo-biblical description of the eternal battle between two tribes in ancient America, the Nephites and the Lamanites, one pious and one profane. And it describes the ups and downs, the battles between these two tribes, and essentially the decadent cycle of empire. It is a reminder that earthly institutions will collapse, and that life absent a godly prerogative is fleeting and doomed to failure. That all human projects are dust, and so therefore the only redemption to this can come from Christ. And Christ does come after his death, according to the Book of Mormon, to reveal himself to these Americans, these early Americans, the Nephites. And this is essentially an attempt to rebrand Christianity, which has all of its most evocative associations with other places, with the Middle East, and which is removed really in its narrative from like the here and now of American life. Mormonism gave the American land that people were treading on an enchantment that it previously hadn't had. It was land trod upon by Jesus. The American people were not just the cast-offs of a European Christianity or a Mideastern Christianity. They were the heralds of a new American Christianity. And it, even though this flew in the face, obviously, of a lot of Protestant orthodoxy, Smith, thanks to his charismatic manner, the fact that the books themselves are compelling, especially when you consider that it is well established that they were written, quote unquote, by Joseph Smith with his head down, slowly saying sentences, and on the other side of a curtain, one of his transcribers writing down what he was saying. It was not anything that he wrote by himself or plagiarized from another source. It all came from his head. And so whatever degree of fraud he thought he knew he was perpetrating, and whatever degree of real truth that he thought the fraud was worth doing to convey, all of it was enough to keep him very impressively focused on trying to convince people of this. And he had a very good luck at accumulating a large number of, and this is crucial, relatively economically prosperous early supporters who were taken by this American vision, which was also, I should say, radically universalist in its convictions, because one of the things that had making Protestantism so dour over the years and had sort of necessitated the Methodist break with predestination is that eventually you can't imagine anybody getting into heaven. And you essentially need a social jubilee to make up for the fact that it becomes harder and harder to live as a Christian as capitalism overdetermines our lives. And so not only did Smith have this vision of godly America and of a godly American people, but also a promise of a loving God. According to the visions of Joseph Smith in this time, he was revealed the heaven. He was shown heaven by God, and what he saw was essentially a eternal nightclub with different VIP sections. He was shown a heaven that was divided into three levels: the celestial, the terrestrial, and the telestial. And in them was the vast, vast majority of humanity. According to Smith's visions, only those who personally rebuke Christ to his face, basically, are spared some measure of salvation, in that there is an eternal life. But there are higher levels for better performers. Those who are able to spend their time on earth perfecting their character through their actions. Perfect their character through their actions, they would be able to ascend to a higher level, with the highest level being the celestial level for those persons who spent their time on earth perfecting their character to the highest degree. And this is a universalist vision, but it also maintains a social engine. It doesn't tell you, hey, everybody's saved, relax. It says, everybody's saved, relax. But now, wouldn't you rather be more? If God has given you this gift and you have nothing to fear, wouldn't you rather more? A greater understanding? The greater your degree of understanding and communion with God is the greater your, upon death, understanding of the universe. So it contains within it both the comfort of sort of a social welfare state, a safety net. It also gives room for the rewarding of personal refinement. And according to Smith's vision, the only way you could refine yourself is if you could live a life that was fully invested with religious belief, which means you had to escape the clutches of capitalism as it was as it was squeezing the life out of upper New York from both ends of the Erie Canal. So very early on, Smith's vision of the Mormon Church is for it to be a new city on a hill, a resuscitation of the Puritan idea of reconciling spiritual desire to live in a godly way with the bountiful continent of America by seizing some of that available land due to expropriation of natives, and then remaking social relationships away from the market and towards community. And that is what Smith spent the rest of his life trying to do, over and over again, building religious communities that then eventually collapsed from internal crisis and external pressure, causing the movement to a new outpost, all the way until the final reckoning at Nauvoo, when Smith is was killed by an anti-Mormon mob, which really ends the prophetic age of the Mormon Church, and which is where we'll end this episode. Spoiler alert. The first is Kirkland, Ohio, where Smith tries to organize a social mechanism, organize a body of believers into a corporate social form. So not only does he begin the creation of a church hierarchy, so this flies in the face of most of the other evangelical preference for horizontal authority within the movement, and instead imposes a hierarchy. Now, it is a lay religion. There is no formal priesthood within Mormonism. Every adult male is ritually initiated into a priesthood that gives him certain authority within the church, but only within a hierarchy of other authoritative bodies. There's the first presidency of the church, which was held by Joseph Smith. There was the High Council. There was the Quorum of the 12, which is a pretty baller name. And there was another larger group called the 70s. And all of these different groups were made up of different, more or less influential people within the Mormon community, and whose job it was basically to maintain a coordinated social effort. And one of the things they did with this hierarchy was to try to initiate something that Smith called the United Order, which was a church program to have land held by people in the church, owned by the church itself, and then the products of that land distributed to members of the church according to their need. And this was a doctrine of the early church that Smith insisted on when his followers started moving to Ohio. And so he attempted to create this Christian communal social order in Kirkland. And this is very similar to the things that were happening with the Oneida organization, only, more explicitly tied to religious prophecy rather than secular morals. But there was a problem with this effort, which Smith tried again and again as he moved west, because the richer members of the church were more reluctant to communalize their property than the poorer members. And so the people who signed up to do this tended to be those who needed more than they had. And that led to struggle. And it was part of that process that was pulling these people apart from each other as it was bringing them together. But Smith made a very valiant effort to try to transcend the market within the bonds of the church and to allow people to live as free citizens with, I think, his eventual most apocalyptic vision, imagining eventually all people coming under this new social order because of its superiority, because it would win in competition with the grubby emergent capitalism of the now godless American empire. So by the mid 1830s, Smith is in Kirkland. He's also sending people out into the Missouri Territory to look for new lands there because they're already getting static from local non-Mormons who are freaked out by this weird cult. And there's already a bunch of former Mormons who break away from the movement and then come back to denounce it because there's a lot of people who come to Kirkland who come because of Smith's promise of access to personal prophecy. And so there are tons of prophets running around Kirkland. And there's also a lot of ecstatic religious behavior. There's speaking in tongues. There's rolling on the ground. There's all kinds of ecstatic reveries. And a lot of people claiming different things to have been told by different things by God, many things that contradicted what Smith was saying. And Smith had to battle against a lot of these early competitors because he had really opened the door for that. And the thing that aided him was this social structure that he had built, this hierarchy, which people were invested in and which gave them a direction. And so when rivals challenged Smith, Smith was able to affirm an orthodoxy that was sustained by the majority of the church. And so a lot of people left in resentment, and some of them came back to denounce Mormonism. A lot of the most fervent anti-Mormons in Ohio and Illinois and Missouri are former Mormons, but the church maintains its cohesion. In 1837, Joseph Smith has an idea to charter a bank because he is looking to, harness capitalism to this social vision, to this religious vision. And a bank is a way to do that. It allows you to circulate currency and build capital, especially in these quote unquote frontier conditions. The legislature refuses his charter, and Smith does it anyway, and starts circulating hundreds of thousands of dollars in currency from this bank, which he picked a bad year to do that because 1837 was the year when the flow of credit from Europe slackened a little bit, causing a massive currency crisis as all of that circulating currency from all of those banks was called in, and all of the bank vaults were found to be empty, including Smith's bank. So after the fall of the bank with the local population turning against them, Smith moves to Missouri, where there had already been an encampment of Mormons. But in Missouri, there is an immediate escalation of conflict with the local non-Mormons, and something that is later called the Missouri Mormon War erupts. This is an escalation of conflicts between local non-Mormon settlers and Mormon settlers in Missouri. A lot of it over allegations of things like polygamy, which by this point, Joseph Smith and his inner circle of Mormons were all big time into. But also there were questions of political power. Mormons were largely abolitionist in sentiment, and Missouri was a slave state. There was questions of whether the Mormons were going to be able to dominate local politics because of their numbers, and there was a question that they were trying to impose religious views on those around them because what the Mormons are trying to do here, bind Americans to something higher than themselves in order to maintain and protect like this spiritual dimension of their lives, struck non-Mormons, the people who had more readily acceded to the framework and values of the early republic, found tyrannical and threatening, the same way they did Roman Catholicism and Southern slavery. It was all a vision. It was a haunting vision of being socially coerced, but because of sort of the wild possibilities of the frontier, people really did conflate like the coercion of a slave to the coercion of someone who operates out of a sincere religious conviction that informs their actions. And it was enough to cause an escalation of tensions. The Mormons formed a militia that they called the Danites, which carried out some violence against local non-Mormons. A Mormon editor had his Printer smashed by a mob. Mobs love smashing printers in the 19th century, by the way. One of the absolute favorite mob activities of the 19th century, like turning over a car after a football game, is to the 20th century. That was busting up newspaper printers in the 19th century. Oh, also tarring and feathering, which they did to the editor. And then this escalated to the point where Smith himself was jailed by the state of Missouri for committing treason against it. Well, a massacre of Mormon settlers left 17 women and children dead. And that combination finally made the Mormons get the hint. And they moved in 1839 to Nauvoo, not Nauvoo, no, there were no Gungans. Nauvoo, a small town in southern Illinois, which was originally called Commerce, hilariously enough, was chosen by the Mormons to become their new site of settlement. And they, in 1839, it was absolutely swamped with Mormons who essentially took it over and renamed it Nauvoo, which means to the beautiful. And immediately, Smith and the Mormons started about trying to build a new city. They used the same design that they had in earlier attempts to build towns, big, wide, 4-acre lots with straight streets, a grid plan, basically, with lots of land in the city for agricultural production. The idea being that you would create a economic engine that was self-sustaining. The people would eat the land grown there, and then they would trade amongst themselves and with others, and they could grow prosperous. But it would be at every level an economy controlled by members of the religious community, by people within the communion, people who went to the newly built temple, and went along with all of the myriad of social activities that the Mormons, with all of these social engagements that Mormons became maniacally obsessed with. The theatrical groups, dances, there were parties. There was no ban on or contempt for secular entertainment because it wasn't really secular. Most fervent Protestants in the rest of the country viewed things like dance and theater as decadent and sinful because they associated it with out there. But for the Mormons, who felt like in the bosom of a religious community, they weren't threatening because they were all happening within a family. And family became, for Smith, the main structure he used to try to build this new durable social network that could withstand the buffets of capitalism. And he did that through plural marriage, polygamy, his most controversial revelation, and one his wife was not happy with, and which many of the women of early Mormonism were not happy with, but which in Smith's mind went towards solidifying social bonds with people, making real the abstract connections between members of a community. Many of the wives that Joseph Smith picked up, and he was like Pokemon there for a while in the early 30s, catching them all. Many of them didn't leave their homes. They called it spiritual marriage. And all it did really more than anything was confer a social obligation onto people that hadn't been there before. This is all part of Smith's family-focused vision, a social vision, turning the family into a model that is then reproduced in the church itself and the society that the church creates. The church and the people working together, growing crops together, trading together, build. All through this network of families. And family becomes the defining metaphor for Mormonism, not the individual. And so another part of that is, and Smith has another prophecy, that those who died before the church was formed, and those who die outside of its vision can be baptized posthumously, which makes sense because remember, there's no real hell for Joseph Smith. Everyone basically is saved to some degree or another, but a baptism posthumously could raise that soul to the higher level, and that sparks a mania for genealogy that defines Mormonism to this day, and which serves as a reinforcement of these ideas of family as a transcendent institution, whose hierarchical structures are reproduced, whose benevolent I should say. And that's the assumption behind all of this. And this is, of course, what is corroded over time and is now, a parody of itself. But was the original vision was a benign hierarchy of family that is reproduced throughout eternity. And that the afterlife is a continuation of those family bonds. Because one thing that sets Mormonism apart from all other religious traditions within Christianity at this point is its emphasis on the limitlessness of human potential. In traditional Christianity, humans are lesser than God in a meaningful sense. God is an eternal being. We can only eventually seek union with God. And like I said, that is religion as an expression of that ineffable sense of connection with eternity that is pulled away from that we are pulled away from every day in our lives by the demands of life, by the demands of sustaining ourselves, which by the time of the Mormons means engaging in this degraded market, in this degraded asocial life where you are meeting in your day strangers who you're interacting with through these cold commercial relationships. So, of course, for Smith, our families are eternal. You stay with your family for eternity, but your old family, your ancestors will be there too. Everyone will be there in a great interlocking connection, but you will maintain your individuality. And that is where Mormonism really is the perfection of American religion, because it imagines God not as an eternal being, but as a human being. Towards the end of his life in Nauvoo, Smith laid out a theory of God as a perfected, essentially, man, and that all human men anyway, had the potential to be perfected eternally into their own God. This is a cosmology that could only exist in the context of North American settler colonialism. This vision of a limitless frontier of human potential and domination more than anything is not thinkable in regions of the world where human society is settled into a static relationship with itself. In North America, the asymmetry between the technological capacity of the settler colonists and the native population meant that an unprecedented mass of territory was up for grabs. An entire continent could be rewritten by people if they had the will to do it. And Smith's vision was to write that vision of eternal perfection into the world by dominating the continent, and then, of course, the stars and eternity, and eventually to become God over one's own universe. And this is the spiritual resolution of the problem that the Puritans had, which is that they felt God as a alienated being, as an inscrutable, wrathful mind, whose intentions and desires could not be divined, and that is a terrible God. It's a vengeful God. But a few hundred years later, with the creation of this machinery of westward expansion and this promise that is undergirding all of every social class, that there is an opportunity, that there is access to livelihood and prosperity. In that context, God can be good. And more importantly, you can be God. That singular, that isolated perspective that you now are forced to live with, that is separate from God, that can become God literally. And our ability to cooperate in the settlement of the continent will let that happen. And for this moment, Smith has his flag planted in Illinois, in the newly christened town of Nauvoo, where he was elected mayor in 1842. Now, at this point, the Mormons have been hounded out of Ohio, hounded out of Missouri, and are already having conflict with the local non-Mormons in Illinois. All of this is putting a toll on Smith's ability to hold this thing together. And in that environment, Smith begins a massive recruitment drive to bring converts to the fold, and then to, instead of having those converts stay at home, come to Illinois to live here in the New Zion. And the place where this missionary work had its most profound impact was Great Britain. So by 1838, there's 1,400 Mormons in Great Britain. By 1847, it's 16,000. A big reason for this is that the Industrial Revolution is ramping up in England, and citizens and people there are being thrust into these newly horrifying conditions of industrial labor. And it's among the populations of new urban workers in Manchester and Liverpool that the Mormons see their best recruiting done. Not only do these people hear a vision of religious community, that vision is one of communal property. It's one of cooperation. It's one of fresh air, access to food, escape from the wage relationship, and more than anything, a way to emigrate without fear of just falling through the cracks as a relatively poor immigrant, which happened to a lot of people when they got to the United States. The existence of the Mormon community precluded that for the English immigrants. So while he's doing this, Smith is also trying to build up the church's national profile. And in early 1844, he decides to run for president. So Smith had been arrested in Missouri. He was really being castigated in the national press. By now, there is a national awareness of what Mormonism is and a general repulsion towards us. And Smith tries to get ahead of it by getting a bunch of his supporters together to form a political party and get him on the presidential ballot. So the Mormons got together, formed a new party called the Reform Party, got a convention, and nominated Joseph Smith for the presidency. He won on the first ballot, if you can believe it. And his vision was to pitch to America the idea of a theodemocracy. And it would involve compensated emancipation for slavery. He wanted to create a national bank. He wanted to reduce the size of the House of Representatives. He wanted to abolish prisons, including debtors' prisons, and opposed the annexation of Texas. Smith viewed this campaign as a way for him to get Mormonism out there, and he sent a bunch of he spent a bunch of campaign operatives to eastern cities with the dual goal of pitching his presidential campaign, soliciting support at the ballot box, and also to recruit new Mormons. But before Election Day could happen, trouble came to Nauvoo. So in early 1844, while he's getting ready to run for president, there's a dispute among some of the Mormons in Nauvoo, and some of them form a splinter group. They were mostly married, they said, because they claimed that Joseph Smith had proposed to their wives, and they weren't into it. So this splinter group of Mormon breaks away from the church, but begins to criticize it. And they put out an issue in June of a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor, which calls for reform of the church and condemns Joseph Smith, calling him a would-be tyrant and theocrat and a polygamist demon, and that he was trying to use polygamy to seduce people's wives. Smith, as mayor of the town, got the city council together and banned the newspaper, and they went down and they smashed up that printing press. And that caused a local furor among the non-Mormons of the area who were already terrified of the pretensions, the theodemocratic pretensions of Joseph Smith, and feared that he would try to make them like him. And this attack on free speech, which of course is very funny because, as I said, there's nothing any political mob of any persuasion in the 19th century loved doing more than destroying printing presses. But they used this, became the pretense for Smith to be arrested by a local sheriff, and then while him and his brother were in the second floor of a sheriff's office, a mob with blackened faces stormed the jail at Carthage, where Joseph and his brother Hiram were being held, and both were shot. Hiram in the face. Joseph Smith fell through the window. His last words were claimed to have been, "Oh Lord, my God." But they kept shooting him after he hit the ground. And that was also obviously the end of the Joseph Smith presidential campaign. So here we have now this community of believers around this prophet who had organized their lives around his preachings. We're now trying to live together in some approximation of community with these new jerry-rigged political institutions and this church hierarchy with its rituals and duties that bound each member to each other member, was left without their prophet, the one whose vision they all believed in and who could move the church one way or another with his preference and with his voice. He was the prophet. I mean, by this point, he has gotten a monopoly on all of the major prophecies of the Mormon community, and now he's gone. What next? How does this group reforge their beliefs in a way that allows them to keep together in the face of the serious resistance they face from without, and also the contradictions that are rife within it? Well, tune in next time for part 2 of the Mormons Going West.